have made it plain enough that British armed forces could wipe the Irish nation out of existence. No one but a madman would question it. And in that sense, then, there was, during the negotiations, as there has always been, as between England and Ireland, the element of duress present. Nobody doubts that had we been able to do it, we should have beaten the English out of Ireland as our simple right. Had we been able to do it, we should have whipped England decisively, and then the treaty negotiations would have been conducted in Dublin, and we should have been a conqueror nation announcing terms of surrender to a vanquished foe. The only reason that did not happen was because we could not make it happen. What good end is to be served by pretending otherwise?
I have to communicate with Sir James Craig tonight. Here are the alternative letters which I have prepared. One enclosing the articles of agreement reached by His Majesty's government and yourselves, and the other saying that the Sinn Féin representatives refused the oath of allegiance and refused to come within the Empire. If I send this letter, it is war, and war within 3 days. Which letter am I to send?
This is the story of 3 December days. In just 70 hours, a sequence of events will take place that will change Ireland forever. 5 men have been sent to make a deal with the British, and they are about to be confronted with a stark ultimatum. The fate of the nation now depends on Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, Robert Barton, George Gavin Duffy, and Eamon Duggan. The choices they make on a cold, foggy day in London will decide whether it's war or peace, who lives, who dies. The truce which ended the War of Independence was signed on July the 11th, 1921. It brought to an end a 2-year guerrilla war against the British, which had ravaged towns and cities and left hundreds dead. But it also brought to the surface all the buried tensions that existed between the key members of Ireland's nationalist movement. Personal rivalries took second place when there was a war to be fought against a common enemy. But when there was a lull in the fight against the British, the seeds of future bloodshed were sown. Soon after the truce was called, the negotiations on the treaty began. Ernie O'Malley recalled how crowds of London Irish lined the streets to see the men who are now entrusted with Ireland's future.
Lá miúil Ceirviohin, tugadh faoi deara seanna bhean éireannach gur seáil ar a fuileáil timpeall ar churas T. Lloyd George is rá Downing. Thug Lloyd George féin faoi dearí agus tháinig sé go dtí an doras, dosca lé agus glí sé orthaí. Catar wit a ddíobh ar an príomhheara, an bhéad le mé ní a dhéanamh dúirt. Is féidir a dúirtí, bí aslam an siomra eiscint ina míonmhar grunithe agah. Thug sé leis isteachí agus theispáin sé an siomra crunithe dí. Cásín tusa ar siise, chuir sé lágar chathaoir agus meanga ar a bhéal. Thug sí mhaith. Cásí an tuachtarán de bhaléire nuair thuca sé. Theispáin sé chathaoir eile dhí. Chuirdigh sí brolach a gúna agus thug sí budéal beag go raibh corca an amach. Thug sí amach an corca agus chris sí cuid dá raibh sa budéal lena méranta ar an gcathaoir agus ar an urlóir fin na bun. An sin chosric sí féin. Sin isce cosrice don uachtarán ar siise, gus stúirí dia éin ar a híonn sé ansa chun éire a héire. Hiúil sí a dro na chathaoirach Lloyd George féin, chris sí go flúirseach air. Bhí aoine ar dús ar an bríomhheara a chuine sé meanga ar ríis, chun an tuthe a chur ar an deabhail é sin a dúirt sí, agus chuir sí an corc sa budéal agus chur a rais ina brulach é.
De Valera would not head the delegation that went to London. Every member of the cabinet and every Choctaw of Dáil Éireann wanted him to conduct the treaty negotiations, and many of us pleaded with him not to remain behind, but he was immovable. The reason he gave us was twofold. First, he said it was beneath his dignity as President of the Irish Republic to leave his country. And second, he could not afford to put himself in a position in which he might do his nation irreparable harm by a chance word across the conference table. He insisted his value to the Irish people would be greatest by remaining in Dublin, and from that distance, guiding us in our task.
When De Valera said he wasn't going, it was argued that it was like leaving your best player in reserve. The first party set off for London in early October. This included all the plenipotentiaries except for Collins, along with a team of backup staff. De Valera chose his negotiating team carefully in order to appease various factions within the Sinn Féin coalition. Arthur Griffith represented the constitutional approach. Robert Barton was De Valera's man, as was George Gavin Duffy. Eamon Duggan was chosen for his legal expertise. The last delegate to arrive, Michael Collins, was there for the Army and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. It was clear from the outset that the idea of a new republic composing of Northern and Southern Ireland was not on the table as far as the British were concerned. The best that could be hoped for was some kind of association within the empire. It was a price that would be worth paying if that led to a united Ireland, but this would need the approval of the Protestant majority in Ulster and in particular the new Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Sir James Craig.
It now merely remains for De Valera and the British people to come to terms regarding the area outside of that which I am Prime Minister.
Collins said that for us to agree to any conditions defining the future relations of Great Britain and Ireland prior to Craig's giving his assent to the unity of Ireland was impossible. That to do so would be to surrender our whole fighting position. That every document we ever sent them had stated that any proposals for the association of Ireland with the British Commonwealth of Nations was conditional upon the unity of Ireland. That unless Craig accepted inclusion under the All-Ireland Parliament, the unity of Ireland was not assured, and that if he refused inclusion, we should be left in the position of having surrendered our position without even having secured the essential unity of Ireland.
Lloyd George had hoped to get Craig to agree to an all-Ireland Parliament, but his refusal forced the British Prime Minister into a change of strategy.
I'm offering to create an all-Ireland Parliament with Ulster to have the right to vote itself out within 12 months. And if it did, a boundary commission to be set up to delimit the area.
Negotiations were dragging on. The Irish delegation was refusing to budge on the Ulster issue, and Lloyd George was under pressure from his own government to bring matters to a head. As Erskine Childers, the Secretary-General of the Irish delegation, noted, Lloyd George, being ever the showman, did so in typically theatrical fashion.
Lloyd George became agitated and accused the Irish of trying to use the Ulster question to break off talks when the real difficulty was the opposition in Dublin to membership of the British Commonwealth. Then dramatically, he turned to Griffith and accused him of going back on his promise not to repudiate the Boundary Commission proposal. Furthermore, the British Prime Minister produced the memorandum that Griffith had approved back in November. "What is this letter?" Barton whispered to Collins. "I don't know what the hell it is." "Do you mean to tell me, Mr. Collins, that you never learned of this document from Mr. Griffith?" Lloyd George asked. The document outlining the Boundary Commission proposal was passed across the table to Collins and Barton. Both saw it for the first time. Collins said nothing.
I have fulfilled my part of the bargain. I took the risk of breaking my party. You in Ireland often bring against us in England the charge of breach of faith. Now it is for you to show that Irishmen know how to keep faith.
I said I would not let you down on that, and I won't. I said, provided we came to an agreement on other points, I would accept inclusion in the Empire on the basis of the Free State.
Do I understand, Mr. Griffith, that though everyone else refuses, you will nevertheless agree to sign?
Yes, that is so, Mr. Prime Minister.
That is not enough. If we sign, we shall sign as a delegation and stake the life of the government on our signature. Is the Irish delegation prepared to do the same?
The Ulster question threatened to put an end to the negotiations. The Irish delegation was refusing to budge on the issue, and Lloyd George was under pressure from his own government to bring matters to a head.
Mr. Griffith said, speaking in his soft voice and with his modest manner, "I will give the answer of the Irish delegation at 9 tonight. But, Mr. Prime Minister, I will personally sign this agreement and recommend it to my countrymen." "Do I understand, Mr. Griffith," said Lloyd George, "that though everyone else refuses, you will nevertheless agree to sign?" "That is so, Mr. Prime Minister," replied this quiet little man of great heart and great purpose. Michael Collins rose, looking as though he were going to shoot someone, preferably himself. "In all my life, I never saw so much passion and suffering in restraint."
Ever the showman, Lloyd George did so in typically theatrical fashion. He stood up holding a letter in each hand. Both were addressed to Sir James Craig. One spoke of a signed treaty and peace, the other of terrible and immediate war.
Whichever letter you choose travels by special train to Holyhead and by destroyer to Belfast. The train is waiting with steam up at Euston. Mr. Shakespeare is ready. If he is to reach Sir James Craig in time, we must have your answer by 10 p.m. tonight. You can have until then, but no longer, to decide whether you will give peace or war to your country.
Everyone who heard the British Prime Minister believed beyond all reasonable doubt that this time he was not play-acting and meant all he said. I wonder if you realize the monstrous iniquity of that. The complaint is not that the alternative to signing a treaty was war. The complaint is that the alternative to our signing that particular treaty was immediate war. The position was this, that if we, every one of us, did not sign and undertake to recommend, fresh hordes of savages would be let loose upon this country to trample and torture and terrify it. And whether the Cabinet, Dáil Éireann or the people of Ireland willed war or not, the iron heel would come down upon their heads with all the force which a last desperate effort at terrorism could impart to it.
Both Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith at this moment saw the shadow of doom clouding over that fateful paper, their own doom. Michael Collins was not appalled by the spectre of death, but he had the Irishman's fear of encountering that charge which comes so readily to the lips of the oppressed, that of having succumbed to alien will and betrayed their country. He asked for a few hours to consider, promising a reply by 9 o'clock.
The Cabinet had certainly told us that they were prepared to face a renewal of war, but a situation had now arisen which they had never visualized. Griffith had gone over to the English. In Dublin, he had declared that he would not break upon the question of the crown, and yet he was sent back as our leader. He'd been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and smashed, and he now proceeded to smash us.
Nine passed, but the Irish leaders did not return. 10, 11, and they were not yet back. We had doubt as to whether we should see them again.
It's just a few weeks before Christmas 1921, and Ireland is a country ravaged by war. Law and order had been eroded away in the War of Independence. There are plenty of guns and plenty of gunmen, and there are scores to be settled. Despite a truce with the British, there were attacks on British troops and RIC men. Some simply acts of local vengeance, others calculated to provoke a British military response. Over 100,000 men are out of work. There are robberies and seizures of property, whether for the cause of the Republic or for private gain. Set against this backdrop, Arthur Griffith decided that his country had suffered enough. He had promised Lloyd George not to let him down on the Boundary Commission proposal, and whatever the personal cost, he would stick to his word. In the mind of Richard Mulcahy, the IRA's Chief of Staff at this time, this was the action of a very brave man.
The question arises to my mind as to whether these are not the most valiant words ever spoken in the course of Irish history. They were the words of a man who, in an unquenched gaiety of spirit, had suffered poverty and degradation and apparently fruitless labours for years, entirely devoted to the service of the uplift of the people in terms of spirit, economic well-being, social happiness, political strength. Griffith must have, by 5th of December, been fully aware of the dangers that were inherent in the inconsequential approach of persons like Stack and Brewer. And he must have been fully aware of the internal difficulties among the most important British members of the negotiating group. I cannot feel that in his most wearied, his most frustrated, his most disappointed moment, Griffith would yield to any element of despair, either personally or for the Irish people. But I feel that these words represent a supreme valour that in another might have to be called despair or recklessness.
As the negotiations in London were reaching a critical stage, Eamon de Valera was in Limerick inspecting the Western Division of the National Army. That night he stayed at the family home of Patricia Lavelle.
He was there, staying with grandfather in Strand House, and with them, amongst others, were Dick Mulcahy and my cousin Michael Rinn, who was the equerry. There was a guard of honour of 32 volunteers, and these were also lodged in Strand House, in the huge cavernous rooms of the basement. Must have been at least 100 years since such a number had occupied those dark flagged rooms. There were great meals prepared for the whole party.
De Valera's host, Stephen O'Mara, had been a Home Rule MP under Parnell back in the 1880s.
In the course of the evening, sitting round the fire, De Valera asked grandfather, "What did you really think of Parnell?" "I'll tell you what I thought of him," grandfather replied. "If I were crossing over Sarsfield Bridge and Parnell said to me, 'Jump into the river,' I would jump." And there they had it. The tremendous personal magnetism of a leader dead over a quarter of a century was brought before them. Upstairs, there was plenty of brisk conversation, but behind the talk, everyone's thoughts were with the delegates in London. News should come in at any time.
The Irish delegates in London had retired to consider the momentous events of the afternoon. At Cadogan Gardens, a rumour abounded that the unthinkable was about to happen, much to the amazement of members of Collins' staff, like the Secretary, Kathleen McKenna.
Bhí sé tar éis leathaí a hocht nuair a chuala mé na cárna ag doras Gordini Cadogan. Rith Collins agus a hlua cinúnach fear sias an holla agus cusan arda suas an staire. Sarvad tháinig broi de ruid a nuas an staire go dtí mifig. Dúirt sé go raibh Michael Collins Olive chun an conra a híú an ihe sin, agus gur cheartlam dul go dtí Hans Place, mar go raibh seans go mbeadh gálam an. Dúirt broi go dúchach sé in éanachlam. Higamar go raibh daoine ag fuileáil timpeall in san scá.
A copy of the revised British draft terms was delivered to the Irish delegation's headquarters at Hans Place at 9 o'clock. Michael Collins arrived shortly afterwards.
Bhí mí aine Michael ná raibh an chuid eile ribh sa hala. Shiúil sé sias agus suas seomra an bhí go nervhíseach. Chuir sé duine ag in áirde staire chun rá go raibh sé híos, ach níor chuair sé féin suas. In ionad sin, shiúil sé faoi mar bheith anmhí alta i gás, sias agus suas, grúama, ciún, duchialach. An son, cha sé féin an nuas ar ná chaithir seomra bia. Agus méid féchant bhris mo chrí le brón, nuair a chuimh níos ar an géasa agne a bhí ag brú ar an bhar seo. Igus go hamnán trimme na fragrachta a bhí búilte ag cún sí ná rah aon smacht ag orthú ar a rúile óga fiala.
A copy of the revised British draft terms was delivered to the Irish delegation's headquarters at Hans Place at 9 o'clock. Michael Collins arrived shortly afterwards. Griffith spoke almost passionately for signing.
Up to this moment, it had never occurred to us that Collins intended to follow the lead of Griffith, but we had hardly started talking when he declared that it was his intention to sign also, and Duggan, of course, followed suit. It was as if the world fell in pieces around us. All three then turned upon Duffy and me. Collins insisted that we knew nothing about the extremity the country was in, or the exhaustion of the volunteers. His brilliant system had been rendered helpless by elimination of its key men. He knew that physical resistance, if resumed, would collapse, and he was not going to be the leader of forlorn hope. He intended to live to fight again.
At different times, Griffith, Collins and Duggan were on the point of proceeding to sign without the others, but Barton stalled them. The argument went on for so long that the delegation was still at Hans Place more than an hour after the time limit set by Lloyd George had passed.
We had doubts as to whether we would see them again. If only Michael Collins has as much moral courage as he has physical courage, we shall get a settlement. But moral courage is a much higher quality than physical courage, and it is a quality that brave men often lack.
We had the most frightful battle in the delegation amongst ourselves, at which the most terrific things were said to Gavin Duffy and to me by Collins and Griffith and Duggan. 3 times they put on their hats and took their coats to go without us. "Barton," said Duggan, "you will be hanged from a lamppost in the streets of Dublin if your refusal to sign causes a new war in Ireland."
Barton's signature was crucial. He was De Valera's man, and without Barton's support, any agreement would be undermined. After some 2 hours of argument, Barton began to wilt.
My dilemma was that whilst I knew the Cabinet and Ireland would face war under united leadership, I had no idea what they would do when 3 of the principal leaders had ratted. I was acting in a public capacity, not a private one. When 3, including Collins, whom I had always looked upon as the pivot in our army, had agreed, what would the rest do when faced with war under divided leadership? Had I known Dev, Brewer and Stack better, I would not have signed it. What was perhaps the determining factor with me was that I had no idea whether, having refused to sign and thereby flung the country lads into war, I should not have been told when I returned that I had no justification for committing the country to war under divided leadership. This was an eventuality never dreamed of. Not one of us, not even Erskine Childers, thought of the instructions that had been given us before we left Dublin for the first time, that the final draft or the document about to be signed must be brought home for confirmation. If Duffy, Childers or I had stumbled upon that fact in our memories, we could have found justification for our refusal, and the articles of agreement would have had at most 3 signatures only, if any. Nobody thought of the instructions.
It was 11:15 by the time the Irish delegates made their fateful journey from Hans Place to Downing Street. Winston Churchill, as Britain's Secretary of State for War, was awaiting their return.
As before, they were superficially calm and very quiet. There was a long pause, or there seemed to be, and then Mr. Griffith said, "Mr. Prime Minister, the delegation is willing to sign the agreements, but there are a few points of drafting which perhaps would be convenient if I mention at once." Thus, by the easiest of gestures, he carried the whole matter into the region of detail, and everyone concentrated upon those points with overstrained interest so as to drive the main issue into the background forever.
De Valera's party was still sitting at the fireside in Strand House, when in the small hours of the morning the telephone rang. It was Garroge O'Sullivan, a member of the GHQ, with the news that the treaty had been signed. De Valera claimed that Arthur Griffith had promised to consult the cabinet before signing the document. And when Mulcahy took the call, De Valera declined the invitation to come to the phone.
On Monday night in Limerick, I heard over the telephone that some agreement had been reached, and I felt like throwing my hat in the air. I felt certain, on account of Griffith's undertaking, that our proposals had been accepted.
Very early next morning, there was a telephone call for the visitors. Grandfather thought it might be news of the treaty at last, but nobody said anything. Grandfather drove to the station with De Valera. Nothing of any significance was said on the way. There was a reserved carriage on the train, and De Valera stepped into the main compartment of it. Michael Rinn was following him when Dick Mulcahy tapped him on the shoulder and indicated the end carriage, in which they then ensconced themselves. Nothing was said, but something had surely happened.
On the train to Dublin, De Valera sat apart from Mulcahy and Michael Rinn, and it has often been speculated since that the Civil War was planned on that train.
A stop press was being cried along the streets. The treaty had been signed. They all knew it, and the very last to know was Grandfather. If he privately felt annoyed, publicly he was the more greatly admired for the guard he could keep on his tongue.
The news was out. Just as the newspapers were about to report on the latest failure of the delegates to reach an agreement, suddenly there was a historic announcement to make, as the Times of London reported. The brief news of the agreement reached the Dublin newspapers about an hour before they went to press this morning. Nothing could be altered at that late hour, and only one newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, found time and space for a word of comment, expressing its confidence that the peace terms conformed to the principles for which Ireland stands. There is no visible excitement in Dublin today, and those who remember the public jubilations whenever the Nationalist Party scored a political point in the old times are struck by the contrast. The greatest incident in 700 years of Anglo-Irish history happened in the small hours of this morning. But this afternoon, not a single banner or illumination brightened the murky streets of Dublin.
Bích na siopí go hálín, lásta súsa níthe, agus na fuinneoga go lásta le gachin rud an nullag. Agus détá dullag fécin dearthú, lá nó ihe, trí nó cahar mágin. Ó, bhí mis mue fanna híthe. Hé mis gcónaí go dtí cléirís chun fécin isteach I ngach fuinneog. Agus bhí siopan sin fráid talbóid, gainís. Well, an fearr leis an siopa sin, deir sé leat dul sáil dénach ihe nullag, agus thorc sé gwit na breg an a bhí fáca. Ó sure an sin bheith flád bheag agin an tráid, agus bhíimiis ag áran. Nead a rís ná go meach busca ceol ag duine aigen, agus beidir go rathamiis amach an tráid ag áran. Ó, bheag gach aine ag rinke an tráid am nullag.
Elizabeth Murphy's sentiment was shared by the Times of London. The first thought which occurred to many was that the coming Christmas will be the happiest which Ireland has known not merely since 1913, but in the present generation. Emotion exhausted itself today, and the country waits quietly upon events. I am writing before the actual arrival in Dublin of the terms of the agreement, and in the meanwhile, the Dublin Mansion House appears to be without news. That night, the Mansion House was more concerned with the 13th century Italian poet. A night of lectures and recitals was being staged to commemorate the 600th anniversary of Dante's death, and De Valera had returned to Dublin to chair the event. He was accompanied by the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Count Plunkett, Alderman Cosgrave, Sir Thomas Esmond and Austin Stack.
He donned his gown and was about to lead the way into the round room when who should arrive but Mr. E.J. Duggan and Mr. Desmond Fitzgerald. Duggan reached the President an envelope which the President ignored. Duggan asked him to read the contents. "What should I read it for?" "Oh," said Duggan, "it is arranged that the thing be published in London and Dublin simultaneously at 8 o'clock, and it is near that hour now." "What?" said the President. "To be published whether I have seen it or not, whether I approve or not." "Oh, well, that's the arrangement," Duggan replied. The President took up the envelope, opened, glanced over the contents. At that moment, he appeared to me to be an almost broken man.
The Kerry TD, Piers Basley, was speaking at the Dante commemoration and shared the stage with De Valera.
Bhí me hí an acleis agus ba atram an brú agus an bhuthalacht a bhí curtinne séid. Agus a linn amas ar fad, níor an cunra edit is leit aige. Níor se curtit a hoa ag hain, stad ina a gunra. Ba chosúil go bégur síníomh an cunra, gandal a góir leis hain dús, is mú a bhí curtinne séid. An cunra hain, an tunchar do haig wint na héidan, níor an méidin ach na dar na hearts.
It was an act of disloyalty to their president and to their colleagues in the cabinet, such as is probably without parallel in history. They not merely signed the document, but in order to make the fait accompli doubly secure, they published it hours before the president or their colleagues saw it.
By the following morning, De Valera had certainly read the treaty, and he told members of his cabinet who were still in Dublin that he intended to oppose it. He also wanted Collins, Barton and Griffith out of his government upon their return. Despite pleas from his colleagues, he made his displeasure known and released a statement.
In view of the nature of the proposed treaty with Great Britain, President De Valera has sent an urgent summons to the members of the Cabinet in London to report at once, so that a full Cabinet decision may be taken. The hour of the meeting is fixed for 12 o'clock noon tomorrow. A meeting of the Dáil will be summoned later.
It was really an infamous performance on the part of De Valera, as the leader of the nation that he was appealing to issue this letter at this time. For all practical purposes, it was tantamount to his meeting Griffith at the boat at Dunleary and slapping him publicly across the face.
The terms of the treaty, the price of the peace, was published in the morning newspapers. For those who had fought in the War of Independence and fought for an Irish Republic, men like Ernie O'Malley, it made for difficult reading.
Basic malach to portrayin. War leis seo a bhí mar a trid, leis seo a chréachamar sin féin le linn an toscogi. Nuair a hep an chéad arog sin bhís gan mothúir be. Annig tuirse bhór orm. Hí mé síos le hasan warad. Bhí mé fí mar a bheith fearr a bheith a géirí a cheanna chusant bhilí a bhí ag teacht ó gach taobhéir. Bhí mar gá ilan an márad, mar gá lá a gwinibh misisiní. Ní raibh mar chumas smaoinmh. Deach mé an mala mar a rá léirscáil den chríochailt. Buin mé an úrsa agus gramí méid an bhhardaí agus mé a féchant go dáir. Thusig crut ag teachtar dom. Déanach cnic agus sléifte as na línta cóirde. Déanach cuilte as na pastí beag a glasa agus ní na hauna ina línta gurma tríd na glántaí. Seo í an tír gur chridimer ar a son. Lan méid na teornacha. Barací fullada, dóirte nó unsathe. Tríd an táin a lasa a bhí mar chórda or. Aspáin siad chuna sa teománach an náid siar isteach ar a phríomhlínte cumarsáide. Circil chorama do bhluc hitheh Paulíní, Carnóga gurama do Varací mílata, ar gomplachtaí beaga marcáide de pean Louis Jarg, Clive de Trasner a chéile in nuach corcra Indiach ar láthracha inar fridmid. Bhí star an cheantar os machóir. Lan mé ar gwiblinti beaga, ar muana, ar depine. Thiom ní mar sin féin don tír seo. Ganach an bás nó an prísún mar luch séhir dúin. Bhí an rud céine déanta ag grúnta ráin, na marmh, cad a cheap siad san.
Despite the misgivings of the veterans, the effects of the treaty were immediate and dramatic.
In view of the agreement signed yesterday between the representatives of the British government and the Irish delegation of plenipotentiaries, His Majesty has approved of the release forthwith of all persons now interned under Regulation 14B of the Restoration of Order in Ireland regulations. Instructions have been given accordingly.
Nuair a dagmuid ar an ferógra, chuí rint farc ag an Cionfort, hasban siad an talta, agus déir siad go scéalaí leithach lá. Bhuaigh sé leithach ar an Gaslan. Luaigh sé funte an olas a bhí aige, ach sé an freagra fuair sé nach raibh aon olas an siúd air, agus ná raibh siad chun ordaithe a ghlacadh an Evening Telegraph. An sin, níos déanaí san oíche, hanig ofigacht míleata leis an scéal go rómar le scialú saor. Lóir sé leis an dáchéad is céige prídeanach agus dúirt go stíorfaí ar maidin sin, le gach aine lú áis. Farír bhí talán a thucail John Gistin, agus amsiú i caiiciis ribh sin é, tar éis timpeall fiche slaat a bheith tóchailte. Cur gardas a cisteann sin agus líonú an talán. Ag bhíomar ar fad le saoirú inis agus bachama mar galar sin.
The Irish Independent reported the delegates' return. They were accorded an enthusiastic send-off at Euston from hundreds of Irish people who had assembled on the platform. Mr. Collins came in for a lion's share of the demonstration. In the stampede, he lost his hat, but smilingly struggled to his carriage with the assistance of 12 police, who had all their work cut out for them in keeping back the cheering crowd. The crowd was so dense in the vicinity of the plenipotentiaries that the signal for the start had to be given from the bridge on the platform. The crowd renewed its cheering and sang a soldier's song as the train left the platform.
Anish, in sa tithe bochta timpeall na nullag, ní raibh aine in East le Brí. Ba chumach ó bochta sa bhí tú, chairigh gach aine le na chéile. Na bochtáin, chuir rud ag an ar fáil a gcónaí dóibh. Mana raibh fuac acu, chóraach duine ag an dóibh é. Jochad a chuinil nullag, chuinil dhearag a gcónaí, sa an asca ó a thiop a groséire. Bheach na fuineoga maisithe, péinteáilte agus péinteáilfaí doras an hala. Ní mór ná gur dá glas a bhí ar gach aon doras, agus ins na fuineoga chuir dhís cullen agus ainán agus na curtnaí lá sa bán.
As Dublin prepared for peace and for Christmas, the delegates and the treaty were on the overnight mailboat from Holyhead to Dunleary. On deck, Collins was in conversation with two of his men, Liam Tobin and David Nelligan.
Tobin said, "We'll have to face our diehards now." The first time I'd heard the expression used in Irish politics. We were to hear it often enough afterwards. He thought the British government had surrendered to murder. High-ranking British military were nearly all Tory in politics and of course took their cue from General Macready. This officer, who had in his final reports to the British government stated that his troops were in the last stages of exhaustion, no doubt gave expression to bellicose remarks to his colleagues. The Major also thought that the Irish would be at one another's throats in a few months. I put this down to another English libel at the time. "If the treaty was not passed," he said, "we will flood the place with troops." This was mere bluff, because we knew they had not got them. The great majority of soldiers who had gone through the First War had left the army, being heartily sick of soldiering. In fact, it was a good job for the volunteers that they had to face only poor, young, raw conscripts, for that is what most of them were. After all, it was the rank and file who carried the can, as they say themselves.
Griffith, Collins, Barton and Duffy travelled all night and reached Dunleary at about 6 o'clock in the morning. People had gathered at the pier as early as 3 o'clock and waited patiently in the cold December winds to welcome them home. The Irish Republican Brotherhood put on an organised army reception for Collins and Griffith when they arrived at Dunleary.
Na hifigig agus na fear go rúil mé lo, saoíocht dom grá marú lorú. Bhí cuid acu be cuine, bhí a súla atathe. Dan mynd go ngáfri na tuscarí. Ní raibh éonú drás acu síú, gaman scéad a churfií brád an rialtas. Héad cuidigrin go ngáfa iad go luas a hanadidir a dír, ach níor hála ada. Hahan na gcuidumpar leis na nuachtáin, pur na cóirlí chunta aontas nó asaontas an úl. Hébhíh an clír glahas catlicach trí chéile leis an síú. Heol mé na teachtarí chuig na ranáin timpadorm, agus fu mé amach go raibh céad agus trí ranán an deisgurt in aig an chonartha. Ach go raibh an chéad ranán iarthach, tríd is tríd ar a héamh. Bhí dá éireann is cosúil chun díospóireachta dhéanamh ar na hartagal. Céim fáil nach raibh ar chumas an uachtaráin, sucrú a dhéanamh ar an gceist.
Early that morning, Dublin Castle sent word that the IRA prisoners were to be released that day. All around the country, the first impact of the treaty was clear for all to see, as reported by the Irish Independent. From an early hour, a huge crowd gathered outside the grim walls of the prison, and at about 11 o'clock, the front gates were thrown open, and a deafening cheer was heard when it became known that the men were about to emerge. Burdened with bundles containing all their personal goods, they appeared at the entrance, and according as each man passed through, he was subjected to an ovation which became almost frantic in its enthusiasm. Numbers of men were seen to shake hands with the British officers standing at the gate, and the utmost good humour prevailed on both sides. The majority of the men who were incarcerated at Kilmainham were arrested at the Custom House or in its vicinity on the day on which the building was burned. It was ascertained that about 200 untried and uncharged prisoners were released. Despite the jubilant scenes outside the prisons, there were already ominous signs. The previous evening in London, the delegation had been given a tumultuous send-off by the Irish exiles. The welcome in Dublin was distinctly cooler.
It was, in a sense, prophetic that there was no welcoming crowd and no signs of jubilation on reaching Dublin. Instead, the few people about seemed strangely apathetic. This lack of jubilation among the people was dispiriting enough, but it was nothing compared with the open hostility we faced in the cabinet drawing room of the Mansion House. De Valera was waiting there, looking gaunt and depressed, while Stack was in a blazing mood, and Brua was the personification of venom.
The cabinet meeting which immediately followed the delegation's return concentrated on the way in which the treaty had been signed without the cabinet's authority. It took Cosgrave's urgings for De Valera to agree to hear the delegation's account of what happened. Griffiths and Barton's arguments that they had only signed under conditions of extreme duress did not allay De Valera's, Stack's and Brewer's feelings that their trust had been abused.
As the cabinet embarked on an exhausting day of resentment and recrimination, the trickle of prisoners continued to flow from Dublin's jails. Outside Kilmainham, a local undertaker, Medler and Claffey, helped shuttle the men home, while Mrs. Medler entertained those waiting for a lift.
Chuirmar or Garna agus ar Goshi ar fad ar fáil don na fear Sarah, agus Yomanamar Awalia gadi a dithe féin in Malia Clia iad. Dol vig mission loan do siúd a vig fehéir duras. Ví slú a gialg oirach, báú bagoila, Saidúir ag fara ón Malcoin os Cionan Giata. An Saidúir vig buintan Galashtan Giata vi sé sin níos dáiréra, is do go tiisgur cá sé obair go crúi an vagin sin.
I arrived to find De Valera head in hands reproaching Michael Collins for signing. De Valera was to speak at great length that day. He centred his opposition mainly on the fact that the delegates had not referred back to him before signing as Griffith had promised to do, claiming that he would have gone to London had it not been for Griffith's promise not to sign without referral back.
I told De Valera that the whole situation had arisen because of his vacillation. He'd had his chance of going to London and had refused. The disaster was that we were not a fighting delegation. There was much discussion as to whether or not the delegation had signed under duress. Collins said that the position was that in a contest between a great empire and a small nation, the settlement was as far as a small nation could go. Until the British Empire was destroyed, Ireland could get no more. On that basis only was he intimidated.
In the end, Cosgrave decided the issue, voting with Collins, Griffith and Barton against Brewer, Stack and De Valera. The battle to get the treaty rejected out of hand had been lost, and the debate would move on to the Dáil. De Valera left the nation in no doubt of his position by issuing a proclamation that night.
Achardia Gael, you have seen in the public press the text of the proposed treaty with Great Britain. The terms of this agreement are in violent conflict with the wishes of the majority of this nation, as expressed freely in successive elections during the past 3 years. I feel it is my duty to inform you immediately that I cannot recommend the acceptance of this treaty, either to Dáil Éireann or the country. In this attitude, I am supported by the Ministers of Home Affairs and Defence. The great test of our people has come. Let us face it worthily, without bitterness, and above all, without recriminations.
Cui me go bailio clia, kun olimach cadeve tarlu, kun fisa all car hias and tarum. Cui me stache me gilligans, mar benoslamaks me sa car. Fi an tailach, a hoan eileen, the varver and honorha. Fi Ginger O'Connell, canasi kunta an aramoun. Ni rosha chi na hele. Vi sé sasta galore na hele gwitina. Rinne sé mun na vorda, the casa a cheen, fui mar benoslesh agus Jane Green. Then ash vi Michael Brennan, canfert an chéad ran on irherrig in a he. Bhíon chuma gur eintig sé féin agus an fear eile go mála chéile. Ribh sin bhí nabla idir é féin agus mó Cathí agus Collins. Tá mar caiintear an arm ar sa Ginger, beidh ceadar gon 50,000 fear bheithan, bín an míniú, bhí a chuid deacrachtaí réitethe, agrú an arm an cheist hábhatach. Chuna sa orbróis sé bheith ar sa mise. Ón IRA ar sesin, tásúla gin Cathlán ma a áil ón dar ran an deisgurt darm an sirstoit, féidir bhreathe de cheantarsa, ní ra focail asam. Cébéad fear a bheith tú an anna hurt ar sesin. Cai tú tríd im cheantarsa má thugann tú drum le a bhion ar sa mise. Dimig an gáire daig Ginger. Sin é an áit a baid tú cogad fioch for an láirlach. An son, dagus an siomra.
When the tumultuous events of December the 8th, 1921 were over, Michael Collins arrived on the doorstep of his old friend Bat O'Connor.
Bhí sé hosúite ag gomachtaí an le gur staidse licam baris tar éistum é oscailtá. Éiscinstum ina hasamh an son. Dearach aitir aig ní atain hiiscint agus díomhréastá cad le scúltú fanacht. Teapas ná beach an áil tú róm a bheit a dearach gur Collins. Dúras leis thuga sé reis an conras seo is úntach an rudde. Teasíonn sé ón daoine. Cafford a leid sean sa húrtstóibh a dúirim a chranúil An sin má héanann siad ach ní héanann siad beidh do chuid díanta a gutsa. Ní bheidh éon reagaracht ort as na tarthaí. Well, chuid son súignas beagar Collins ach beagán sin ile. Bhí sé rá lán de díomra sa síos. Bhí sé siad suas an siomra céanna inar ITS dul go London sa chéadáid. Cahaf a láf san agus ag bagart belag lí a ágans agus file a chacaí dá mófa ar an gonra. Má hasannaíon a hiile truda ar sesin. Trudig me go hoscailte le heis má wintir a féin ó yes. Ní bheidh me i má réocht agus ar má hethe timpeall bhaile lí faoi mar a bhíos le háb líon anas.
After an exhaustive debate in the Dáil, the treaty was ratified on January the 7th, 1922, a month and a day after the delegates signed in Downing Street. It was carried by 64 votes to 57. The end of a centuries-old conflict had come down to 3 days in December and one piece of paper. On the events of those fateful days and the treaty they produced would hang the fate of the nation and the fate of the men who signed it.
When you have sweated, toiled, had mad dreams, hopeless nightmares, you find yourself in London streets, cold and dank in the night air. Think, what have I got for Ireland? Something which she has wanted these past 700 years. Will anyone be satisfied at the bargain? Will anyone? I tell you this, early this morning, I signed my death warrant.